Well, it wasn't long after college in my first job that I found myself itching for the next thing. I, like most young professionals, once they step into the real world, was brimming with self-confidence. I had unrestrained ambition. I had this great desire to fulfill all the posters from my grade school classrooms. I wanted to step out and I wanted to become whatever I wanted to be. I wanted to seize whatever opportunities presented themselves. I wanted to step into the world because the world was my oyster. I believed it. I wanted to step out and I wanted to take over. This was my mentality when I came out of college and I was in my first job. I thought to myself, I have something to prove. I need to seize the moment. I need to leave my mark. People need to know that I showed up. This was my mentality. I was ready to soar as high as possible, reach the ultimate limit. And yet, I found myself missing one small detail. Though I was ready to grab hold of any ladder and scale it as fast as possible, as high as possible, I didn't necessarily know what ladder I was supposed to climb. Because you see, like most other young professionals, I also was overwhelmed with so many different possibilities. I was recounting this at this time. I found that at this point in my life, just a few months into the second year of my first job, that I was offered a new career, new job, chance to inaugurate my church's college ministry, join a residency program, begin my seminary education, serve on breakaway sermon prep team, and marry a girl that was way outside of my league. I had so many different opportunities. It was a special time in my life, and so I did what any sensible person would do when given so many different opportunities. I said yes to all of them, which was a really bad decision. You see, where I thought the sky was the limit, after I embraced all of these new opportunities, it felt like the sky was falling down. When it felt like the world was mine to take over, I adopted all this responsibility, and it felt like my world was crashing down around me. It felt like everything was coming to an end. You see, at this point in my life, after I accepted all of these different things, I was spread thin. I was overcommitted, I was overworked, I was running on fumes, and I felt like I was ethereally laying on the table and flatlining. It felt like I had given so much of myself to everything else in the world. To put it very simply, I was overworked. Does that sound like somebody you know? Yeah, chances are it sounds like you, because it sounds like us. I was doing some research. In 2016, a survey conducted by Project Time Off, which is widely regarded as one of the leading analyses on workaholism in the last decade. It reported this after surveying 5,000 young professionals like yourself. They found that 43% of those young professionals identified as work martyrs. What is work martyrdom? Well, they identified as people that agree with the following statements: that no one else at my company can do my job while I'm away. That I want to show complete dedication to my company and my work. That I don't want others to think that I'm replaceable. That I feel guilty for using my paid time off. 43% of young adults, people like yourself, almost half of this room, agreed with these statements, agreed to being identified as a work martyr. For a more recent study, not in 2016, but in 2020, Forbes, they reported that 66% of young adults suffered from workaholism, which is also known as work addiction, which is a really interesting addiction, a really interesting phenomenon in our culture, because we don't celebrate addictions. Whether you're a believer or a non-believer, we don't celebrate things that take our lives captive, except for this one. You see, if you were to drink an entire handle of gin, nobody would be applauding you. And yet if you work a 16-hour shift, people are like, dude, you know how to get out there and get it, bro. Like, that's the response that people have. We celebrate workaholism, this work addictive personality. And what we find is that as Forbes continued this study, 70% of young adults, they were available and they were actively working on the weekends. 70%. 63% of young adults, they claim to work while sick. And interestingly, 32% admitted to working even while on the toilet. I don't know what you call that, but I call that a problem. You see, we are workaholics. The line between our personal lives and our professional lives, it has grown dangerously thin. And we're living up to the moniker that the world has put upon us, that we are the burnout generation. There are phrases of speech that have become all too common amongst us. Things like hustle culture or quarter life crisis or vacation shaming. These are phrases that we've adopted commonly, that we're familiar with. We are addicted to work. Now, you may hear that and think, Kylan, listen, I know that people are addicted to their jobs. But I'm not. That's not my case. Other people are, but not me. And while that may be true, we also can acknowledge that while people, they vary with respect to whether or not they're addicted to their jobs, we largely, based upon scientific research, are the most hurried culture in human history. We are addicted to busyness. We like to go. We don't want to stop. We are statistically more hurried today than we have ever been in human history. You see, and it's for a variety of reasons. I don't know what your reason might be, but I know for myself. It could be just a desire to succeed. For a long time, I was driven by a desire to meet the same sort of level, the same level of achievement that my peers did. It could be that some of us were afraid of being bored, not ever amounting to something, not fulfilling our purpose, not making a difference in the world. Others would say that they have a fear of loneliness, and so they just throw themselves into their work. We all have a variety of reasons for why we work, but the truth of the matter is that the data's in, and the results are clear. We're busy. We're hurried. We don't like to slow down. Our culture has not promoted that this is a desirable idea. No, we're meant to be productive. Keep going. Be efficient. Be effective at what you do. And thankfully, Jesus has something he wants to say about it tonight. You see, in the Gospel of Luke, which we've been working through as we've been walking through this series called Outcast, what you see in the Gospel of Luke is that you see Jesus over and over and over again come up to different people, the marginalized, the outcasts, and he engages them right where they are. And tonight in Luke chapter 10, so if you have a Bible, you can turn there, he's going to work with a workaholic. He's going to walk up to somebody, and he's going to unpack for them three very specific things. He's going to show them the danger of distraction, the importance of posture, and lastly, the necessity of nearness. This is what Jesus is going to do. So if you're at Luke 10, we're going to pick it up in verse 38. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. It's on the screens behind me. This is what it says in Luke 10, verse 38. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village. And a woman named Martha, she welcomed him into her house, and she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him, and she said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Then please tell her to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." You see, we can't see it from this passage alone, but as we find Jesus in the story, word of his power and his authority, it has spread all over. And as his authority has become more and more and more renowned, what we see is that his reputation has grown. And so as he comes to Martha's house, where Martha, her sister Mary, and their brother Lazarus live, as he comes to their house, Martha does what any of us would appropriately do. She rolls out the red carpet. She welcomes him into her home. He has status, and so she wants to bring him into her house. That word in Greek for welcomed is this idea that she welcomed him under her responsibility. The idea behind it is it's a technical term, that if you were described as being welcoming in this manner, it meant you were hospitable, that you were qualified to take care of the needs of other people, that you not only could take care of your own needs, but you also could meet the needs of those around you. This is Martha in this story. And what's interesting is as we think about Martha, it tells us a couple things about her. That if she's a hospitable person, based upon the technical term in Greek, then we know that she's prosperous, she's independent, and she's generous with other people. She's the model of what we would all want to be true of ourselves. She's independent, confident, self-sufficient. She's great at serving other people, giving of herself for the sake of others. And what we find is that as she does, she commits herself, what verse 40 would say, to much serving. She gets after it. And it's so much serving, in fact, that she's distracted with it. She's busy. She's hosting Jesus. She's taking care of the disciples. She's making sure that they don't want for anything while they're under her roof. And yet, though she's doing all really good things, what we realize is that there's a danger in her distraction. Specifically, there are 3 dangers to her distraction. The first is loneliness. Verse 40 tells us that, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? That's the first danger she faces, that her distractedness with work has made her lonely. The second is anxiety. Verse 41, Jesus responds, Martha, Martha, you are anxious. And then the third is that she's troubled about many things. That word troubled, it means disturbed or panicked. Now, let me be really clear. As we're talking about this idea of busyness, work tonight, work in no way is bad. Like, the Bible is very clear. This story, it is not teaching that work is to be avoided. The Bible itself is not teaching that work is to be avoided. Instead, Proverbs would say that slothfulness or laziness, it's rebukable. And in fact, it rebukes it over a dozen times over the course of the book of Proverbs. No, work is a good thing. God has designed us to work. But here's what's not good. It's not good to be distracted with our work. That's the distinction, and it's a fine line, but I need you to see it. You see, to become so busy that we lose sight of what really matters, and in the process, we jeopardize our own well-being. That is the issue in this story. That is what's happening to Martha, and if we're honest with ourselves, is likely happening to some of us, yeah? You see, we recognize that according to scientific research, work addiction leads to a variety of unfortunate circumstances. It leads to a rise in divorce, anxiety, insomnia, obesity, depression. One great example of the negative effects of workaholism in the life of a person is Sir Winston Churchill. Like, he was the Prime Minister of Britain. He was the World War II champion of his own mother country. And what we know about Winston Churchill is that he was a voracious worker. Like, he kept a crushing schedule. Often he would work up to 18 hours a day. And not only that, he was a consummate writer. Like, he wrote constantly. He wrote over 43 books, 72 volumes. And often, as people would recount the legacy of Winston Churchill, what they would have to account for is not just the amazement of his work ethic, but also the fact that he struggled with depression. What he called himself his black dog. Biographers, they would look at him and say that depression was symptomatic to his work ethic, to his workaholism. To say there's danger in distraction, being distracted by our work, that's to put it so mildly. And yet here's the sinister thing. If you think about it, the negative effects we're recounting here, they come from really positive causes. Like, Mary's not doing anything bad in this story. Like, she's doing all really good things. She's not out here and she's not dealing drugs. She's not an arms dealer. She's not robbing the disciples while they're all sitting around having dinner. Like, that's not her aim. Instead, what she's doing is she is doing a good thing. She's serving Jesus Christ. Like, she's rolled out the red carpet. She's fixed dinner. She's prepared the space. She's giving them a roof over their head. She has gone to great lengths to provide for them. And yet what we learn by way of Martha's example is a really important point for tonight. That you can do good things, but miss the right thing. You can do good things, but you can miss the right thing. That's what Jesus says. He looks at her in the midst of everything she's committed to, and he says, Martha, one thing is necessary, but I need to do all of these other things. No. One thing is necessary. So let's bring this home. Does that sound like you? Like, as you think about your own life, does it feel like, man, I've committed myself to so many good things. Like, I'm serving in my church. I've adopted a volunteer role within this nonprofit organization. I'm mentoring this younger person, helping them to become the best version of themselves possible. I'm committing long hours at the office because I want to be a good contributor to my team and meet my performance goals. Are you doing all manner of good things, and yet at the end of the day, do you look at yourself and find that, man, the effect is negative? That you're whipped, you're exhausted, you're fatigued, you're stressed, you're unfulfilled. If this sounds like you, then you need to know that you are distracted and it's dangerous to your health, both physically, mentally, and emotionally. So what do? How do we move past it? We move from distraction to devotion. That's what we do. There's a verse in Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3. It says, you keep him in perfect peace. Don't miss this. Whose mind is stayed on you. Like, what's Martha's issue? She's distracted. Her mind is not singularly focused. It is divided. It's torn in so many different directions. That word for anxious in this passage, it means to tear something apart, literally. She is tearing her peace into pieces as she thinks about all of the things she needs to do to provide for Jesus, to take care of her house guests. And yet this verse in Isaiah 26 would say, no, the way that you keep perfect peace is you keep your mind focused on the only one that can give peace. You be singularly focused. You keep in perfect peace he whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. You see, it is possible to work hard and have peace. It is. Like, it's possible to commit yourself in such an audacious way and yet have peace in the midst of that great commitment. But the way you find it is not through distractedness. It's through devotion. It's through being focused on Jesus Christ. Which brings us to the next point here, the importance of posture. The importance of posture. It's interesting. When you look at the story, the expectation as we show up to Martha's is that her house is full. It says that Jesus and his disciples, they were making their way, and Martha welcomed them into her home. And so, at the very least, if it's Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, plus Jesus and the 12 disciples, check my math, but you got 16 people in this house. And yet, it doesn't read like that, does it? It doesn't feel like the house is busting at the seams. What it feels like the house is filled with just 3 people. And Luke's really, really strategic about that. He wants you to read this story, and as Jesus sits in Martha's home, see only 2 other people. He wants you to see Mary, and he wants you to see Martha. And the reason for that is because he wants you to contrast their postures against one another. The way that they approach Jesus, the way that they interact with the Christ. He wants you to look at them and say, what are the differences? And we see, as Luke writes this narrative out, he actually describes 2 different verbs for each of them. It says that Mary is found sitting and listening, while Martha is found serving and speaking. You see how opposite those are? They have opposing postures. They are literal opposites from one another. Martha is serving, Mary is sitting. Martha is speaking, Mary is listening. Martha is preoccupied with many different things, while Mary, she is prioritizing one thing. Martha's attention, divided. Mary's attention, devoted. Their postures are opposite. Why is that the case? Because their priorities are opposite. Their priorities are opposite. So what's your priority? Like, as we look at the 2 of them, what we see is that Martha's priority is she wants to do for Jesus, whereas Mary's priority is she wants to be with Jesus. And that is the difference in the 2 of them. For the one that is overworked and the one that walks in perfect peace. One is focused on doing all manner of different things, while the other is focused on being with the only thing that matters, which is Jesus. And our first point, we described Martha in pretty great detail. We said that, man, she's affected in a couple of different ways. She's affected with loneliness and anxiety, and she's troubled, she's disturbed. Now we need to look at Mary, because if Martha's the workaholic, then Mary's the goal to shoot for. And so what we see is that Mary, as described by Charles Spurgeon, is sitting at the feet of Jesus. This is what Spurgeon says. He says about Mary, she is down there in the place of humility, but she is where she can catch each word as it falls, and she is there with one purpose. She wishes to hear all that Christ has to say, and she wishes to hear it close at hand. She wants to hear the very tones in which he speaks, the accents with which he delivers each precept. She, talking about Mary, loves to look up and see those eyes which have such meaning in them, in that blessed countenance which speaks as much as the lips themselves. What's the difference in the 2? Martha is drowning in the stress of life, drowning in it, while Mary is drinking in the words of life. Mary is sitting close by. She is listening to Jesus. It's interesting, if you read that word in Greek for listening, it's written in the active voice and in the imperfect tense. Now, what that means, just so you can understand the kind of listening that Mary has in this moment, is she's listening very intentionally. She's active voice. She's intentionally listening to Jesus, but the imperfect tense would say that she's not just intentionally listening, she's continually listening. Like over and over and over again, she's clinging to the words of Jesus, and she wants to hear them as much as she possibly can, which is just a scandalous idea. Because if you were to look in the first century, Jewish women, they were normally cast into roles of domestic orientation. They would work around the house, they would take care of the house guests, and yet what Mary's doing here is she's not in the house with the women, as would be expected in the first century, but she's sitting as a disciple. She's with the boys. She's hanging out with the dudes. And it is totally inappropriate in this setting, in this context. Meanwhile, Martha is not behaving inappropriately. Martha is doing what is totally good and right and appropriate within a first century Jewish context. She's serving, she's hosting, she's meeting the needs of other people. And not only that, not only is she behaving appropriately, the question that she asks Jesus is an appropriate question. Rabbi, Lord, will you ask my sister to come and help me? That's an appropriate question. So what gives Mary the audacity to do something like this? To sit at the feet of Jesus where the disciples sit? How dare she? Because she knows that when Jesus is in the room, you drop everything to be near to him. When Jesus is in the room, you drop everything to be near to him. Any distraction, you remove it. Any inhibition, you discard it. And we believe this in Metro. That's why I say, you've heard me say it, and I will say it again. We believe Tuesday nights are so special that no Tuesday is like the Tuesday before, because we believe that in this space, Jesus is in the room. And so what do? We do like Mary. We do everything to get as close to him as we can be. Why does she do everything possible? In this situation, why is she willing to embrace indignity? Like she's not supposed to be there. Why is she willing to brave the awkwardness? Why is she willing to endure up underneath the embarrassment that people might have of her as she sits at a place that she's not supposed to be? Why would she do it? Because she knows who Jesus actually is. Because when she sees Jesus, she doesn't just see a teacher, a miracle worker, a wise guy. When she sees Jesus, she sees someone that has come to make all things new. She sees someone that has a grace the likes of which knows no bounds, is inaugurating a kingdom that anybody can be a part of. When she sees Jesus, she knows that he is reconstituting the world. Whatever roles we knew before, in his kingdom, everything changes. This is her approach. She knows that she needs to hear what he has to say. She knows I need to do whatever it takes to get as close to him as I can be, even if it means that I have to embrace an inappropriate conduct. You see, the world looks at Mary and they say, hey, you shouldn't do that. What you're doing is really, really inappropriate. And yet, what is Jesus' response to Mary's behavior? He says that she's chosen the good portion. She chose the good portion. In Jesus' eyes, she behaved perfectly appropriately. So let me ask you, what portion are you choosing? Like, what posture are you assuming as you look at your life over the course of the day? What posture do you take? Like, when you evaluate your life, do you see a preoccupation with practical living? That I need to reach that job, I need to earn that promotion, that I need to make this much money, that I need to contribute to this cause, that I need to give this time or meet these people? Are you preoccupied with practical living, or like Mary, are you prioritizing walking with him? What are you doing? What's true of your life? Are you doing what the world would say is appropriate? And again, what the world would say is appropriate is not always bad. Oftentimes it's good. That's why it's so insidious and deceiving. Like when we look at what the world would say is appropriate, the world would say, hey, keep busy. Like, don't be unproductive, be efficient. Hey, do right by other people and make a good effort at it. And yet what happens when we live lives distracted in the way that the world would say we should live? We find ourselves doing good things, and yet, man, we're unfulfilled, unsatisfied. We're left wondering, and I've been there, is this all there really is? Or are you living a life that Jesus would say is appropriate? Are you waiting on him? Are you trusting in him? Trusting in his timing? Being patient with whatever the day brings along and patient with whoever the day brings along? Are you endeavoring to hear him? Wait on him. Think long in the process of understanding his truths. What's true of your life? You see, posture, it's so important. It's so important, and yet there's also a necessity of nearness. There's a necessity of nearness. We won't take long on this last point, but that's what Jesus' response to Martha is when she asks him to dismiss her sister to come and help her. He says in verse 42, and we've already looked at this, but he looks at her and he says, Martha, one thing is necessary. When we referenced that earlier, that idea was hey, Mary is sitting with me. Martha, you're busy doing other things. You're distracted. She's devoted. And one thing is necessary. And while that is all very true, there's more to this statement from Jesus in verse 42 than we've already talked about. You see, because as he says one thing is necessary, and he references Mary, what he points to is not just that she's sitting with him, but that she is sitting near to him. And that's a massive distinction, because in the Greek, that word, parakathizo, it's the combination of two words, para, which means beside, so she's right here, and then she's sitting, kathizo, meaning that she is sitting as close to him as humanly possible. Luke even goes into illustrative detail, and he says that she is at his feet. So growing up, I had a golden retriever, and that dog loved to get as close to me as humanly possible. If I were petting him, and I stopped petting him, and I stepped away, he would just like inch himself as close as possible, and I would find that his head was nestled underneath my hand. Why? Because I was the object of his affection. And even when my hand would recede from him, he could feel the distance, and he had to get as close as he could. This is a good picture for Mary. Like, she doesn't want there to be any distance between her and Jesus. She wants to stay as close to him as she can. And so she is willing to sit not just with him, but at his feet. And what's amazing about Mary is that every time you read her story, is you see that is always the posture she takes. She understands the necessity of nearness. Over and over again in this story, she's at the feet of Jesus listening to him. At her brother Lazarus' resurrection, what does she do? She falls at the feet of Jesus, grieving over her loss and begging for his help. And then when she anoints Jesus for burial, where is she? She's at the feet of Jesus again, pouring out an alabaster flask of nard, expensive ointment, and wiping his feet with her hair. She is always at the feet of Jesus. There's a necessity to nearness. You got to get as close as you can. Mary was always there. Meanwhile, where's Martha? Where's Martha in this story? Or better question is, where isn't Martha? Martha isn't near Jesus. She's busy. She's out there. She's doing all manner of other things, and yet she's missing the one place that she's supposed to be. You see, it's interesting. Like, she has forgotten the very reason that she welcomed Jesus into her home in the first place. She's gotten so distracted that those distractions have led to distance. And I don't know if that resonates with you. I know that it resonates with me. That as I think about my life and I think about my walk with the Lord, there are times in my life, seasons in specific, where I can look back and I can see, man, I stepped into a really good thing. I started something with noble cause for God's glory and the benefit of other people. And yet somewhere along the way, I got so disenchanted to that idea that it stopped being about Jesus and it started being about me. Like, that's what happens. If you look at Martha's statement, she says, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me alone? She has one statement in this entire story. She says one thing, and it's in reference to who? Not Jesus. It's in reference to herself. She's self-interested in this moment. That somehow the work that started off about Jesus has become about her. And some of you may feel that. Like you may look at your life and you may think about that role you accepted at your job, volunteering for that nonprofit agency, that position you accepted where you were serving in your church. And you may think, man, I agreed to that and I was full of noble, genuine desire. I wanted for God's glory and I wanted to help people. And yet if you're honest with yourself, you would sit here tonight and you would think, man, I started off for good reason, and yet now I'm only compelled by selfish desire. Like truthfully, I wish that I could relinquish that role, give up those responsibilities. I wish I could get back that hour a week in my life. I wish that I could make the decision over again. You see, it started off about him, but somewhere along the way it became about you. If you think about your money, this happens in the same way. That you start off and you're supporting that missionary, or you're giving to that charity, or you're endorsing that compassion kid, and you're all hyped for it. Like, let's go. You're motivated. You want to help the world. Glory to God. Gospel to the four winds. And yet down the road, you look up and you're like, gosh, it is an inconvenience to see that hit my bank account every single month. What I'd give to not have to spend that money on that thing. No, I'd spend that money on something else, something good as well. But what's happened in that process? The same thing that happens to Martha here. You started out welcoming Jesus into the role, into the duty, and yet somewhere along the way, it stopped being about him and it started becoming about you. So why is that the case? What's happened in that story? What happens here? What causes us to grow less focused on Jesus and more focused on ourselves? Well, we can see it's distance. It's distance. That's why nearness is a necessity. If you're not close to God, then you're not going to be close to the things of God's heart. That's why sometimes, even when you do good, you feel bad, which that's such a paradoxical idea that when you do good, I feel bad. How is that possible? And yet, for some of us in the room tonight, we can resonate with that idea. And what we need to know is that before we step out and we continue to do good things, what we really should do is we should stop and we should close the distance between ourselves and Jesus. Like if your faith feels faint, if your heart feels cold, do not leap out and do more good things. No, you choose what's necessary. You do the right thing. You come back close and you warm your cold heart and your faint faith with the radiance of God's presence. That's what you do. And I believe that that's what happens to Martha. We see in Psalm 46:10, it says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." You see, it's interesting as you process this verse, what you see is the first step to knowing God is what? Being still. Which tells us an important truth that the work of a disciple, it always starts with no work at all. That the work of a disciple, it always starts with no work at all. It starts with stillness and nearness. We come close. We remove any distractions that would keep our focus from him. Listen, I've said this already. I'll say it again. Am I saying that you should never do anything? No, absolutely not. God has designed us to cultivate the earth, to subdue it, and to fill it. Like that's our God-given cultural mandate. Like if you read the Bible, there are commands and there are callings for us to go out and to be a blessing to the nations, to the world. I'm not saying that you don't do anything, but what I am saying is that if you're doing things for the wrong reason, if you're serving yourself in the process, then you got to come back to square one. Then you've got to come back to the presence of God. Then you've got to stop doing long enough to start hearing him. There's a necessity to nearness. And what we see as we look all throughout the Bible is that anytime people come and they fall at the feet of Jesus. They decrease the distance. They increase their proximity. You know what happens? Everything changes for them. Everything. Like, I did a personal study on this. I went through the Gospels and I looked up every single person that falls at the feet of Jesus. And every single time, their world is inverted. It is flipped upside down. Like, it looks totally different. Like, the wise men, they come to baby Jesus. He's not even a grown man. And what do? They worship. They can't help but sing. They're at his feet and they're like, we can't help. We can't go back to where we've come. We have to go forth and we have to tell people what's happened. Jairus' daughter, what happens? She's raised from the dead. The bleeding woman that falls at Jesus' feet, she is cured of a lifelong illness. The Syrophoenician woman's daughter, she is healed of a demon. Peter, he is given a new calling in life to become a fisher of men. The leper, he's made clean. The demoniac, who we studied 2 weeks ago, what happens? He's restored both to his senses and to his society. The adulterous woman, she's forgiven. All of these people, they fall at the feet of Jesus. They sit at the feet of Jesus, and everything changes for them because there is power in proximity. This is what happens when you come close. And this is probably the most impactful thing I'll say tonight. At least impactful for me, and I hope for you. It's not just that there's power in proximity. It's not just that you should come near. It's that if you read this story and you read it rightly, Jesus is bidding you come near. Like, he looks at Martha, and he says her name twice. He says, Martha, Martha. And we read that, and we might think like, man, Jesus just had it with her. He's exasperated. He's impatient. He's like, do I have to tell you again? I've told you a million times, Martha. Like, stop getting out there and just working yourself to death. No, his response, as we read it, it's emotion-filled. Like, he sees all of her busyness, all of her distractedness, and he comes to her and he speaks to her love. That's the way that he engages her. And that's the thing, he's speaking that to us tonight. Like, some of you tonight, you need to know that he sees you as you are. Weary, burdened, totally shackled to the work of your day and the busyness of your life. And he's calling you back close. He's bidding you come sit with him. Hey, come near to me. Sit down. All of those things, we can return to them in a moment. It won't take long because a moment with me will change everything for you. Jesus wants you near. The question is, are you willing to come near? There's a necessity to nearness, and we better believe it. Just as I close, I was reading earlier today, and I came across an example that I thought would be helpful. So earlier today, Granger Smith, country artist, he shocked the country music world by sharing an emotional video message announcing that he would be retiring after 24 years on tour. He said this in his Instagram caption. He said, "This message is so difficult to post. The words for this caption are so hard to find, not because I don't believe in the truth of them, but because this marks the end of the longest era of my life. Touring, 24 years. As he continued, he started unpacking why he was retiring, and he shared plans to enter into full-time ministry. And so he continued and he said, "This summer will be my last tour. I'm so encouraged and hopeful and excited and joyful about the next chapter, but to a large extent, I have no idea what it will look like. I just want to glorify God the best way that I can. I want to learn and grow and serve my local church and allow my pastors to equip and affirm those next steps. Lord willing, I want to be used to help people find their purpose." 24 years on tour. He's only 43. Like, what would compel someone with all of the influence and all of the notoriety that Granger Smith has to give it all away, to sacrifice his career, to stop the work he's been doing, and instead begin a new type of work? What would compel him to do it? Well, you should go read the article, you should go watch his video, but just to give it to you in short, he tells us that he was having a difficult time harmonizing his work and his worship. And it was too consequential. You see, in an industry that rises and falls depending upon your acceptance before the masses, Granger Smith, he acknowledged that as he stood upon stage, he felt this constant pressure to exalt himself, to glorify himself. And yet, as he came to know Jesus and listened to Jesus and walked with Jesus, he realized he alone is deserving of the glory. Like, I can't steal that from God. I can't be so dualistic, say that I'm a believer, and yet stand on stage and accept the praises that only God's do. He quotes Mark 8. He says, no, I'm meant to deny myself. And that's exactly what he does, because nothing is worthy of jeopardizing your worship, not even your work. So listen, I was on the fence about whether or not to say this tonight, but I think that someone may need to hear it. Am I telling you to quit your job, to change your career, to end your commitment, whatever it may be? Am I telling you to do that? No, I'm not. But God may well be. Like, God might be looking at you and he might be saying, hey, you have gotten into this career, into this job, into this position for the wrong reasons. And I'm asking you to give that thing up. I'm asking you to lay that thing down. I'm asking you to not sacrifice your worship for your work. I don't want you to sacrifice your proximity to me with all manner of other kinds of activity. I don't want you to do it. Friends, there's no worthier pursuit. There's no higher aim. There's no greater quest in life than this, than to be near to our King. No work in your life is worth the cost of your worship. All things are worthy of laying down for the sake of being close to him. And the reason we know that is because Jesus Christ was willing to lay all things down to be close to you. As you read the Bible, what you see is that Jesus was never endangered by distraction. That never once did he take his eye off of you, that he knew he wanted you for himself. And so he singularly pursued each and every one of us out. But it's not just that he was never endangered by distraction. We also see that he understood the importance of posture. He was the Son of God, like the Most High. And yet he adopted the proper posture, becoming like us so that he could reach us, so he could be close to us. And not only did he acknowledge the importance of posture, but he grasped the necessity of nearness so far to the point that he was willing to lay down his life to pay for the cost of your sin, to give himself hung up on a Roman execution rack, mocked, jeered by the whole watching world for the sake of you, identifying with his death and then identifying with his life in his resurrection. The call is so simple tonight. Sit at his feet. Listen to his words. And before you think about anything else, you enjoy the company of a king who enjoys the company of you. Let me pray for us. Father, we're grateful for tonight. And God, truthfully, not much more needs to be said. The invitation on the table, God, from you to us tonight is to come close, to sit near, to listen intently, God, and to hear you speak into our life the things that we need to hear. Identity, security, purpose, fulfillment, God. You are the only one that can give us these things. And we confess, Lord, like we have sought them in work. We have looked for them, God, in busyness and distraction. And yet, God, tonight we have a clear moment where we know, man, life isn't found anywhere apart from you. It's not found in a job. It's not found in a promotion. It's not found in my distractedness, my busyness. It's not found, God, in mentoring people or making an impact or leaving a mark or reaching the heights of societal success, God. It's not found in any of those things. No, the only place that life is found is in you. You have come that we might have life and we might have it abundantly. Jesus, I pray we'd believe it. I pray we'd believe it. If you're in the room and you don't know Jesus, but you hear that message and you know I've looked for life and yet it's found only in him and I want it, then all you have to do is acknowledge I'm a sinner. God, I cannot save myself. When I look deep inside, I see something horribly wrong. And yet I know, Jesus, as I look to you, I see something wonderfully right. One that would give his life for my sake. And so I believe that you died my death, the death I deserved, and that you rose from the grave. And as you rise, you call me to rise with you. If only I'd place my faith in you. Jesus, I place my faith in you. If you did that tonight, please come talk to one of our prayer team members. Please come talk to me. Talk to a friend you came with. Because we want to celebrate with you. Because you just moved from death to life. For the believer in the room, for those that have been walking with the Lord, are you doing good things but missing the right thing? Answer the question for yourself. Let us respond together now in this moment, and let's do it freely. Listen, I'm just going to be honest. We've got one song. Do not wait. Lord, we love you. We sing to you now. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Metro Podcast. This is Jillian, and I am sitting here with Kylan discussing the talk that you just listened to on the podcast called Jesus and the Workaholic, where we studied Mary and Martha and their interaction with Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. And today, Kylan and I are sitting here just discussing any further ideas and concepts that he wanted to discuss just to go further into his talk. So Kylan, what more did you have to say or thoughts that you wanted to unpack yesterday that you didn't have time to discuss yesterday at Metro?
Yeah, there's a lot we could say. Every single week, we talk about how there's always more content than we actually have time. That's one of our biggest prayer requests. So if you're hearing and you want to pray for us, that's always helpful because we always are trying to figure out what do we need to distill down so that way we're able to teach the passage, honor the integrity of God's word, and be helpful to people. And yet there are always more thoughts. And so a couple of thoughts just based last night on the passage we looked at from Luke 10, Mary and Martha and their interactions with Jesus. In the talk, we spoke a lot about how Martha's consumed with much serving. She's distracted with much serving, workaholism. And that's so relevant to young professionals. And that is a major idea, a huge theme over the course of that passage. But there's another theme at play there. And it may be something bigger to the story that we didn't really get into that I think may be helpful just as we're visiting here. And it directly applies to this idea of overworking ourselves or indulging in busyness. And it's this idea of discipleship. You see, what we see in Mary and Martha is we see two people that love Jesus that are demonstrating behaviors intrinsically true of a real disciple, genuine belief. You see, what we see in Mary is one that's sitting with Jesus. In Martha, we see one that's serving Jesus. Disciples are meant to do both. Like, it's important that we see this is the emphasis of discipleship, that we're both called to serve and sit with Jesus. There's a time to work and there's a time to reflect. Because if we only ever existed in busyness, like Martha, we would sacrifice our proximity to God. And yet if we only ever existed in restfulness, which Mary doesn't only ever exist there, but she's restful in this story, what we would sacrifice are the purposes of God for our life. We're meant to do both. The issue here is not serving or sitting. The issue for Martha was that she was distracted with much serving, which brings us to another thought that's really important. In this story, she's distracted with busyness. Got to get out there, got to get it done. And yet, this is just one category of distraction. You can be distracted by all sorts of good things, other good things. You can be distracted by dating. Does that guy like me? Does that girl think about me? You can be distracted by leading. Am I doing a good job? Am I leading my people well? You can be distracted with learning, relaxing, hanging with friends. These are all things that can consume our thought life and thus control our practical living. And so as we think about our lives, we do hard assessments, evaluations. What are we distracted by? For many of us, it is busyness, but it could also be other things as well. The last thing that I think is important to note And this is a whole nother side to the conversation about work. And we just didn't have time to get into it last night, but I want to make a moment here to really address this because I think it's helpful. Last night we talked about the importance of being willing to lay down our busyness, all the distractions of our workaholism, putting those things aside and drawing near to Jesus. And yet the other side of that equation is also making sure that we honor the commitments that we've placed upon ourselves, that when we've entered into an agreement with someone, whether it's serving in some capacity or it's leading in some role or it's working in some position, we're doing everything in our power to honor that commitment for the time which we committed to. You see, believers, those that follow God, they don't break their commitments before it's appropriate. Commitments don't break. Commitments come to an end. And the reason we know this is because the scriptures are riddled with it. God, thankfully, never broke a commitment to us. He's faithful. He keeps every single one of his promises. Can you imagine if he didn't? But he does. He honors his word. And so we, made in his image, dignified by his essence, we do the same thing. We see Jesus say in Matthew 5, verse 37, that we let our yes be yes and our no be no, that when we give someone our word, we honor it. And then lastly, Psalm 15:4, and this is a verse that I think often of, is that we keep our oaths even to our own hurt. What is that saying? That the man who dwells on God's holy hill is the one that's willing to honor their commitment, even if it does come at some personal cost to themselves. Now, let's just be really practical. Does that mean that if you're struggling, if you're burning out, if you can't take anymore, if you're at your wit's end, you continue to indulge what we talked about last night, work martyrdom? No, not necessarily. What it means, though, is you should have a conversation with the people that you agreed to work alongside. You should talk to them. And in that conversation, you should share the reality of where you are, and you should ask them to help you find some sense of peace while you help them ultimately fulfill the commitment that you gave to them. I think that that's a really healthy arrangement. So I just wanted to come on the backside here, and I think that that's helpful to say. We want to make sure that nothing gets in the way of our nearness to God, and yet, as God's people, we also honor our commitments. We do so in a way that preserves our well-being and blesses other people at the same time. It's how Jesus moved through life, and so it's how we move through life too. But other than that, I think that those are a few thoughts. Hopefully they're helpful, but that's all I got for now.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, I hope that resonates with you listening. It definitely resonates with me. So we hope that you enjoyed this talk, that you enjoyed this portion of the podcast, just unpacking more of what we learned about yesterday at Metro. We hope to see you back next week at Metro on Tuesday at 7:30. We love you and we're for you, and we'll see you next week.